Hello again. Let's talk about graphic narratives. In this lecture, I want to examine the role of humor magazines in the 19th century, and especially the rise of children's literature and its impact on graphic narrative. One of the great rising stars of the British popular press was Punch magazine. You can tell by its name, the London Charivari, that it owed its idea to the French magazine that was named Charivari, we spoke of earlier. The London Charivari, Punch, was a magazine that started out, like the French Charivari, very liberal in attacking the excesses of the upper classes. But it was having a really rough time making ends meet with that idea, and eventually would migrate toward a more conservative, middle-class points of view. Punch magazine is named after the puppet character that appeared on the parks and beaches in England. Here we see a cartoon by John Leech, and you notice that it's called Cartoon Number 1. This was a humorous take on a competition that was being held for the Parliament buildings. They had invited artists to submit their cartoons, which are their preparatory sketches, to the competition. And here John Leech has decided to enter his own cartoon in that competition. In this way, he is making fun of all of the pretentious submissions who celebrate the wealth and power of the elite, whereas the audience for those paintings are all poor and the downtrodden. With this cartoon, the word cartoon began to stick to the very idea of humorous sketches. So instead of calling them satirical prints, they became known as cartoons. Punch magazine had many venerable institutions, and one was the Punch table, where the gentlemen of the editorial staff would, on Friday afternoons, join together and have a large meal with lots of drinking and joking, and they would mull over what would be their, what they called the big cut. The big cut was the main woodcut or wood engraving that would make up the central feature of their magazine for the week. And this was a very important part of which they advertised their magazine, and what drew people to it would be this very large, beautiful image. And they would then sell that separately outside the magazine as well if it caught on and people wanted it for their own collection. So the big cut was a big deal. And it was a part of this sort of men's club atmosphere that featured it. Here we see the main cover of Richard Doyle's illustration of the puppet Punch and his dog Toby. One of the important ways in which Punch became an important influence in the history of comics was that it was imitated in colonial offices all over the world. In India, Japan, Australia, and elsewhere, versions of the London Punch became popular in these new countries where expats could pick up and explore the themes and satirical ideas in the local environment. And in many cases, this would be one of the first introductions of Western-styled cartoons to these many different countries. As Punch magazine grew in popularity among adults, there was a growing popularity for reading in general, which became known as pocket literature. And then in the 1870s, there became a movement to have all children educated. And this allowed for an even broader and deeper literacy among all the people in Britain. Chapbooks, which had become popular prior to that, were very simple, crudely printed matter, which had songs or tales or sensational news events of the day. This evolved into the penny dreadful, which was a little bit finer printing and a little longer and a little bigger, but they all had this feature of being something you could just tuck into your pocket and pull out when you were on break during work. As people recognized that this had a wide appeal and a huge exposure to all the lower classes, there was a desire to elevate the lower classes with more wholesome material. The Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge put out their own penny magazine, which featured much more closely researched and historically accurate information. Punch magazine would not let this idea of the pretensions of the Society for the Diffusion of Confusion of Useful Knowledge to go unheard. And they saw this movement for the pretentious ways that it was. Penny dreadfuls were widely disseminated and imitated and copied, and took whatever rumor or scandal and made it sensational. If you recognize the title Sweeney Todd from the musical of the late Stephen Sondheim, The Demon Barber of Fleet Street, this is the source of that very same musical. Another story that was popular at this time and repeated many different places were the adventures of the Spring-Heeled Jack, who was a vigilante who created the kind of terror and horror and molested women in the park at night. And by having literally springs in his heels, could leap over high hedges. I know it doesn't sound like much, but he does sound like the precursor to a lot of superhero action later on in the next century. Here is the police news, and on it we see a series of images that could look like a sequential narrative, a series of panels that would tell a story, but in fact, each picture represents a different story that is covered inside. And so it is what was popular at the time called a miscellany, like a three-ring circus. Everything you could possibly want to see or find out is contained within. This we may call today a panoramic narrative. Children's literature grew slowly and steadily during this time, and one of the things that children in France might have is these pages printed by Jean-Paul Pellerin, known as Imagerie d'Épinal, Épinal being the small town where Pellerin operated his press. Initially, in the 1820s, they were four-panel synopses of stories and biblical events, and then they became longer and more complicated stories, and then more and more sophisticated as the century wore on. And this is because people began to expect more from their stories. The idea of picture storytelling was growing in sophistication. These are what we call linear narratives. The action is causal, but they're really just one episode and another and another. They're really not using the full complex way in which sequential narratives had evolved under Topfer. Imagerie d'Épinal was found all over Europe and the United States. This example of Little Red Riding Hood was printed by Pellerin for the Humoristic Publishing Company in Kansas City, Missouri, in the late 19th century. Back in Europe, they had even more sophisticated taste. By the 1890s, odd-shaped panels, complicated arrangements, more contemporary storytelling was in effect, and these became the standard by which people expected to read their visual stories. Children's literature expanded dramatically by the work of Heinrich Hoffman, who was what we might call today a psychologist who worked at the time was known as an insane asylum, which is a house where people who were institutionalized, and he had to interview their children, who were often the only witnesses to the distress their parents were undergoing. And so to gain their trust, Heinrich Hoffman would tell these stories. And he would use these stories as a way to kind of break the ice before he started asking them serious questions. These stories he found quite popular, and eventually he got a blank book, put them down, and they began to disseminate among their friends. Eventually they were published, and they became a huge sensation. The story of Struwwelpeter, the straw-haired Peter, can be seen illustrated in the upper left. He is a boy who has given up all kinds of personal hygiene, and his long fingernails and his shaggy hair has made him into a monster. These sort of funny, sing-songy rhymes, meow, 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 what will mommy and nursey do? The poor little girl was playing with matches, and now she's caught fire and died. And I know this sounds really cruel and quite barbaric in many ways, but there's also a sense of fun and anarchy. There's the story of the little boy who plays with a kite on a windy day and sails off, never to be seen again. And there's the rabbit you see here who steals the hunter's gun and starts firing back. And this is part of the crazy antics where the world is upturned and we get to feel the sense of excitement and energy. Max and Maurice was the creation of Wilhelm Bush, who was a really highly skilled painter, but was having a rough time early on in his career making ends meet. So he began illustrating for popular magazines in Germany when he hit upon these two mischievous boys and their antics. This became an enormous hit and soon made him a regular feature in the popular magazines. And he did numerous stories, not just for children, but also for adults. Here we see the way he used action sequences to build the story in a really dramatic way. You see these two frogs battling over who gets to eat this frog, and the frog is fighting back mightily. And the rhymes he engaged were like Struwwelpeter. They had this wonderful alliteration. This is a fun, energetic, crazy story with these great dramatic visuals. And this was what children could read again and again with this kind of fun and excitement. Now, one of the things that Bush introduced was not only this sort of greater dramatic energy in his drawings, but he also found ways of distorting action in this comical way, like the way these boys are pulled under this wheel and flattened out like a pancake, which looks like something you might see in a Warner Brothers cartoon. And that's what he really discovered, the way in which caricature could be used to distort not just the features of a character and their expression, but the action itself. The energy of the story was expanded upon. This is beautifully realized in a series of drawings he did, showing a pianist getting wilder and wilder in their playing. And you can see how he's bouncing across the keyboard. His hands and fingers are flailing, and he flies across the page. But look at this person to the side who is just listening to the music. They are transformed into a pair of ears and a single bulging eye. And it's this amazing way in which he's allowing the emotional content of the picture to distort the reality of what we see. This is a really dramatic innovation. I love the way the musical instruments just are flying in this sort of crazy way all across the space and lying on the floor, discarded. At this time, the idea of animation and movement were growing, and the sophistication of the idea of motion came around. With this toy, the Zoetrope, a group of kids could sit around this little drum and spin it, and looking through the slots as it spun, they could see the drawings inside animate and move as a single flowing image. And this was a really important idea that it allowed for movement and the capture of movement to become a new sort of critical exercise. Not only could you buy new strips of drawings to put into your Zoetrope, you could actually flip over the pages and make your own. And this became a really fun and exciting, engaging project for a lot of people. And it was all these sort of proto-animation features, long before there was ever moving pictures or film. The earliest captured motion, mechanically captured motion in film, was Muybridge's studies in motion in the 1870s. And this began the movement toward the Lumiere brothers' Cinematograph in 1895, which was the first machine that you could buy, that had film in it, that would be processed, and that you could actually create a film. I think it was about 2 minutes worth of film that you could capture in a single camera before you had to go get it printed. And so these devices really transform the way we perceive movement and motion. But the comics and the ideas of Wilhelm Bush preceded all this and were really there before this machine ever arrived. Back in Britain, humor magazines grew in popularity, and there was a spin-off of the Punch magazine called Judy. Now, Judy in the puppet show is the wife of Punch. This magazine had no real relationship to the Punch magazine. It was just trying to market itself to a slightly younger audience, maybe married housewives. This was something that might have appealed to them. If you notice, all the ads here are sort of toward foods and medicines and things that women might be interested in. In Judy magazine, there were a number of cartoons, and one that became especially popular and long-lived was initially drawn by Charles H. Ross, but it was really taken over and expanded by his wife, Emile de Tessier, who signed her name Marie Duval. Charles Ross had the idea for Ali Sloper, who was a guy who would be a little bit of a schemer and wouldn't really pay his debts and was always going to getting into trouble. But Ross had a bit of a drinking problem and was not very good at keeping up with deadlines. So his wife takes over the strip and really develops it in some really fabulous and wonderful ways. Marie Duval's drawings are more crude. They're more simple than the highly rendered illustrations that were commonly found in magazines at this time. And she didn't take this as a kind of problem for her comic because it was not really her who was drawing this. It was the character Ali Sloper himself who was incompetent. So the incompetence of the drawing was another reflection of the incompetence of the character. And this was a really novel idea, and she experimented with all kinds of different ways of introducing humor through various funny and extraordinary means. Really inventive, much like the work of Gustave Doré in France a bit earlier, who was doing his History of Holy Russia. Unfortunately, with the popularity of Ali Sloper, he was moved off the pages of Judy magazine and given his own magazine. Unfortunately for Marie Duval, because they passed the illustration of the character on to William G. Baxter, who gave him a much more conventional treatment and humor. And we never hear from Marie Duval again. Ali Sloper's Half Holiday was based on the newly legislated Saturday afternoon holiday where the working class could have a little bit of leisure. And Ali Sloper's Half Holiday became a very important way that we could market to those working class people. They did all kinds of stunts to try and improve it. Celebrity endorsements. They even had this crazy scheme that if you were in a train accident and you had that day's copy of Ali Sloper's Half Holiday with you, you could get as insurance against any damages or injuries that you might have sustained because of the train accident. Now, that sounds really far-fetched, but believe me, train accidents were common enough at this time that might have been motivation enough to pick up a copy for yourself. These humor magazines were suddenly undercut by a very ambitious publisher by the name of Alfred Hollingsworth, who went about lowering the cost of his publications in half. And the way he was able to do this was that he used cheaper paper, he stole content from other people without paying for it, and he added a lot more advertisements. Still, at half the cost of all the other magazines, he quickly rounded up and flushed out the market, and with that, he was able to destroy the competition. He became fabulously wealthy because he could print so many of these magazines. I say this because it's really important the influence he had on publishing in Britain. Notice the title here of this magazine called Comic Cuts. Cuts, of course, refers to, again, to the punch tradition of woodcuts, even though they were no longer actually using woodcuts. The name Cuts still is attached to the illustrations that are humorously scattered throughout the magazine. And to reinforce the idea that they are comic cuts. The word comic has been appended. But eventually the word comic would be all that would be necessary to refer to a humorous illustration. And so that is where we get the origin of the word comics.